Before we begin this amazing journey, take a deep breath, subscribe to our channel, and give us a like so you don't get lost in the waves of history. Now close your eyes. Imagine a city that no one has ever seen, but everyone remembers. A city that disappeared beneath the water. They called it Atlantis. We won't argue about whether it was real. Instead, we'll simply tell its story like a fairy tale, quietly and slowly. Welcome to Atlantis as it might have been seen by the dreamers of ancient times. Where does history end and fiction begin? Humanity has been trying to answer that question for thousands of years. And perhaps there is no other legend that has captivated so many minds as the tale of the sunken Atlantis. Our journey begins in ancient Greece. On the street of the Athenian school of philosophy stands a man in a toga with intelligent eyes and a calm voice. This is Plato. He is already over 70 years old. He has lived a long life, written a great deal, but it is now that he is working on one of his most mysterious texts, the dialogues Timaeus and Critias. In these works, he speaks not just about morality, justice, or the structure of society. He tells how Egyptian priests once shared with the great Greek Solon a story about an ancient power, as mighty as nature itself. That power was Atlantis. Plato does not claim that he saw Atlantis himself. He is merely passing on a story that was handed down to him through generations. And yet, the descriptions are too vivid. Mountains surrounded by water, canals crossing the island, metals unknown to the Greeks, laws that are complex and just. But the main thing is the idea. For Plato, Atlantis is not just a city. It is a mirror, a model of the ideal state that became a victim of its own arrogance. And so, when the time came, the gods, seeing that the people of Atlantis had corrupted their souls, decided to cast them down into the depths of the sea. That is how Plato wrote it. And these lines became the foundation of the greatest mystery in human history. Plato's dialogues are often structured as conversations. In Timaeus, it first talks about the structure of the world, the beginning of the universe, and the laws of nature. And only later, almost in passing, is Atlantis mentioned. This creates the impression that the story is true, as if it's just a part of a scientific discussion. Later, in the dialogue Critias, the story continues. We learn about the structure of the city, about society, about morality, about how the inhabitants of Atlantis were just hardworking and strong until they began to live for pleasure, forgetting about restraint and harmony. This is an important point. Plato was a student of Socrates. He believed that inner balance is more important than external wealth. And in the story of Atlantis, he seems to be warning us. When a society loses its sense of measure, it inevitably falls. Was Atlantis real? Historians still argue about it. Some believe that Plato simply made it up to illustrate his philosophical ideas. Others are convinced that he was describing real events, perhaps distorted by time. For example, the eruption of the volcano on Santorini and the fall of the Minoan civilization. But that's not the point. The point is how Plato told this story. Without shouting, without drama, calmly, like a wise man telling a parable by the fire. He doesn't ask us to believe. He simply invites us to reflect. Perhaps Atlantis is not a place, but an idea, a utopia that humanity strives for, but one that is almost impossible to hold on to. We don't know exactly why Plato included this story in his works, but the fact remains. He was the first person to give Atlantis a name, a shape, and a voice. More than 2,000 years have passed since then, and everyone who hears the word Atlantis remembers not so much Plato, but rather the dream of a beautiful, wise, and just world that, sadly, has vanished. The Atlantis that Plato spoke of is not just a place. It is a lesson. In the second part of the dialogue called Critias, he describes Atlantis with the precision of an architect. Every detail is thought out, from the size of the island to the distribution of water and land, from the political structure to spiritual life. Critias, one of the interlocutors in the dialogue, talks about the city as if he had seen it himself. He describes how Poseidon, the god of the sea, fell in love with a mortal woman named Cleito. To protect her, he created rings of land and water, surrounding them like a shield. That is where Atlantis arose, first as a divine gift, then as a human creation. The city's architecture was extraordinary. 3 rings of water, 3 rings of land, with bridges and canals connecting everything, creating order and symmetry. At the center stood the temple of Poseidon and the residences of the kings. Everything was adorned with metals, copper, gold, and even the mysterious orichalcum, a metal whose name still excites the imagination of researchers today. But the main thing was not luxury. Plato emphasizes that at first, the inhabitants of Atlantis lived simply. They were strong in spirit, respected the gods, and worked for the common good. There was wealth, but they did not worship it. There was power, but they did not crave it. This is the essence of Plato's philosophy: reason, moderation, and inner balance. It's as if he's painting an ideal model of a state, just like in his other work, The Republic. But while that was a thought experiment, here about an allegedly true story. And yet, the higher Atlantis rises, the clearer it becomes. The fall is inevitable. With each generation, the inhabitants begin to forget who they are. They are no longer restrained. Their desires grow. They no longer listen to the gods, only to people. And then, as Plato writes, the divine part within them weakened. Here comes the key moment. Plato does not describe the catastrophe itself in detail. He leaves it off-screen, as if to say that the cause of destruction is more important than the manner. It wasn't earthquakes and floods that destroyed Atlantis, but pride. This gives the legend its universality. A state that is too proud will fall. A person who is too self-confident makes mistakes. A society that is too wealthy forgets what truly matters. This approach makes Atlantis not just a myth, but also a moral lesson. Interestingly, Plato never finished Critias. The text breaks off suddenly, mid-sentence. We never learn the whole story. We don't see the destruction. We only sense the coming end. This has sparked a lot of debate. Some believe that Plato simply didn't have time to finish his work, while others think he deliberately left the ending open so the reader could imagine the conclusion for themselves, so that everyone would ask, aren't we, modern society, becoming the new Atlantis? Philosophers of that era interpreted the story in different ways. Aristotle, Plato's student, said that Plato made up Atlantis and was the first to believe in it himself. But others, especially during the Roman era, treated the legend with respect. For them, it wasn't a description of a place, but a warning. Like the myth of Icarus, only on a grander scale. Centuries passed. The story of Atlantis lived on in books, was retold by scholars, and inspired artists. But it all began here with a simple text by a philosopher who wanted to convey something more than just a fairy tale. Plato was speaking not only about the past, but also about the future, a world where people would forget moderation and restraint, yet would still dream of a place where those qualities were once the norm. In Plato's vision, Atlantis is a model of an ideal society, not ideal in terms of wealth or power, but in terms of balance, justice, and spiritual integrity. That's exactly why the story hasn't been forgotten. That's why, even after 2,000 years, people are still debating whether Atlantis was real. But maybe it's not about the facts. Maybe Atlantis isn't a place on the map, but a direction. Not a spot on Earth, but a point within each of us. A longing for something better, for harmony, for order. And at the same time, it's a reminder that everything is fragile and everything can be lost. In the very beginning, there was only land, untouched, undivided, unknown to anyone. It lay in the middle of the ocean, surrounded by silence, waiting for its destiny. And it was here, according to legend, that Poseidon, the god of the sea, arrived. He didn't come with thunder and storms. He came like a dream, like the quiet breath of wind over the water. He saw her, a mortal woman named Cleito, young, alone, living on a high hill in the middle of wild land. They say she was pure of heart and strong in spirit. And Poseidon fell in love. To protect her, he decided to separate the place where she lived from the rest of the world. With his divine will, he created 3 rings of water and 3 rings of land, alternating with each other, surrounding the hill where her hut stood. This was how the first form of Atlantis appeared. In this sacred place, he built a home for her. Not a palace, not a temple, but a house where she could live in peace. And there his children were born. 5 pairs of twins, 10 sons who were destined to become the first kings of Atlantis. The eldest of them, Atlas, became the supreme ruler. It was in his honor that the entire island was named Atlantis. The other 9 sons were given control over different parts of the island. Each ruled his own domain, but was subject to the supreme authority of Atlas. Thus, the first form of government was created, not through violence or war, but through order, structure, and balance among the brothers, where the eldest was not a tyrant, but a guarantor of justice. Plato describes how the divine kings passed their knowledge on to the people. They taught them how to cultivate the land, build, reason, and live in peace. They did not forbid wealth, but taught that it should serve society, not destroy it. The inhabitants of Atlantis developed rapidly. They built ships, dug canals, and created powerful roads. And all of this was based on what the sons of Poseidon had passed down to them. The central city held a special place. It was located on an islet right in the center of the rings of water and land. You could only get there by bridges and tunnels. The city was protected by nature, but it was also thoughtfully designed, as if harmony itself had taken shape in its architecture. At the center of the city stood the Temple of Poseidon. It was enormous, with golden statues and walls shining with orichalcum. Inside stood a huge statue of the god riding a chariot drawn by 6 horses. She was surrounded by dolphins, fish, and waves, and every stone spoke of the connection between humans and the sea. But the most important thing was not the architecture, but the spirit. At first, the inhabitants of Atlantis were humble. They honored the gods, did not crave power, and did not seek conquests. They understood that true order meant inner restraint, respect for nature, and respect for themselves. And yet, with each generation, the blood of the gods mixed with the blood of humans, and the divine part, the one that belonged to the sons of Poseidon, yes, it grew weaker and weaker. This will be important later, for now, though Atlantis was flourishing. They built an irrigation system, grew grains and trees, and raised animals. The island had everything, from fertile plains to rich mines. Metals, especially the rare orichalcum, were mined and processed at a level that even the Greeks found fantastic. It was during this period that Atlantis became a true power, but not yet an empire. They weren't interested in conquest. They focused on building within. The state was divided into districts, each with its own elders and administrators. The laws were carved on columns in the temple of Poseidon and were never broken. The kings would gather every few years to discuss the most important matters and offer sacrifices to the gods. They were united by a blood oath, ritual, and shared origin. This was how not just a civilization was formed, but a legend. What made Atlantis special? It wasn't its size or wealth, but its beginning. According to legend, everything was created not through conquest, but through love. Not from ambition, but from balance. That's exactly why this myth is still alive today, because it tells us that perhaps the best things in history are born not when someone takes, but when someone gives. A city born from a god's love for a woman. A city built on the principles of symmetry, justice, and nature. A city that will one day disappear, but not because it lacks strength, but because its people forgot how it began. Atlantis entered its golden age. Cities grew, the land was fruitful. Canals stretched like veins across the island's body, connecting villages, temples, fields, and harbors. The houses were sturdy and beautiful, decorated with carvings and metal that gleamed in the moonlight. The streets were wide and paved, with carts drawn by oxen and horses traveling along them. At the markets, exotic fruits, rare oils, fabrics, fish from deep waters, and crafts unknown to other peoples were sold. Ships stood in the harbor, ready for trade routes. But they did not carry weapons. They carried bread, grains, fruits, spices, fabric, and wise books. Atlantis' society was built on the principles of cooperation. There were no poor or forgotten people here. Everyone had their own work, their own craft, and all were respected. A craftsman was not considered lower than a warrior, nor was a farmer beneath a philosopher. In schools, they taught not only writing, but also how to observe the stars, the rhythms of nature, and the subtleties of governance. Young people were educated not for a career, but to serve the city. Laws were followed not out of fear, but through upbringing. People did not fear authority. They respected it. And rulers did not take, they served. Temples held a special place in Atlantis. The silence inside was almost tangible. The scent of oils, the flicker of torches, the reflections from mosaics, all of it encouraged contemplation. Here, people did not ask for wealth. They asked for understanding, balance, and grace. The religion of Atlantis was not intimidating, but calming. The priests did not demand, they explained. They taught that every person is part of a whole, that every action is like a ripple on water. Women in Atlantis were equal to men. They engaged in trade, education, agriculture, and even participated in councils. Their voices were heard, their work was recognized. And this gave society even more stability. Families were strong, but not forced. Values were passed down through conversations, not punishments. Children learned by example, through stories, traditions, and silence. Metals were mined in the mountainous regions of the island. Orichalcum, a mysterious alloy, shone like fire and was almost as valuable as gold. But the inhabitants did not worship wealth. They knew that beauty lies in simplicity. The best home is not the most expensive one, but the one that feels warm. There were soldiers, but they did not seek battles. They defended the borders, trained in strategic thinking, but served to prevent war, not to participate in it. And yet, over time, something began to change. Unnoticeably, quietly, as if a gentle breeze had changed direction. Luxurious houses started to appear, each more ornate than the last. Non-essential goods began to show up in the markets. Status symbols, jewelry, rare wines, fabrics that no one wore, only kept. Families started to compete over who was wealthier, who was closer to the Tsar. And the old craftsmen began to fade into the background. In their place, merchants started to appear. The laws were still in effect, but they were already being interpreted flexibly. The priests still prayed, but more and more often they were seen dining with the nobility. Schools kept teaching, but spoke less about the soul and more about careers. This wasn't a downfall, not yet. It was a slipping away, subtle, like dew on glass. And yet the elders noticed, whispering to each other, "We are losing the essence." But most people just smiled. Look how much we've grown, how much gold we have, what a fleet, what a city. And it was true, Atlantis was at its peak. The most beautiful city in the world, the most educated society, the most powerful state. But even at this peak, a crack had already begun to form, small, almost invisible. Plato didn't write about this as a historian. He wrote as a wise man who could see further. It was as if he was saying, when you stop noticing simple joys, silence, hard work, and honesty, you're already on the path to downfall. Atlantis didn't perish all at once. It sailed on like a beautiful ship, but down below, where no one could see, water had already started to seep in. And while people celebrated above, erosion was beginning below. In the next chapter, we'll find out what happened next, when the crack turned into a chasm, when balance was lost. But for now, let's remember, Atlantis was not born for destruction. It was created as a gift, as an image of what the world could be. And maybe that's exactly why it slips away from us so easily, like a dream we once had. But we don't remember when Atlantis shone. At first glance, everything was as it had always been. Cities full of life, bustling markets, majestic temples, gold gleaming on the towers, ships setting sail, schools filled with students. But inside, something had changed. Something in the tone of voices, the expressions on faces, in the silence after conversations. It was as if the soul of the island had begun to grow weary. People no longer listened to the gods. They listened only to themselves. Kings no longer sought the counsel of wise men. They surrounded themselves with flattery. Laws were no longer sacred. They became convenient. Wisdom gave way to pride, humility to luxury, and education to ambition. Priests appeared more and more often at feasts, while ordinary people showed up less and less at the public gatherings. Even the temple of Poseidon no longer seemed so sacred. The gold on its walls now caught the eye more than it inspired respect. People captured images with their eyes, but stopped feeling with their hearts. Young people no longer sought to learn for the sake of understanding. They studied for power, for titles, for influence. Children dreamed not of becoming wise, but of becoming famous. Kings began to fight each other not with weapons, but with intrigue. Their councils started to resemble games. Who could outsmart whom, who would get the best seat. Trade kept growing, but with it came greed. Ships no longer carried grain as gifts to allies. They transported rarities and were sold for astronomical sums. Where there used to be mutual aid, a market of competition sprang up. The wise men who once sat in the shade of the columns became a rare sight. They withdrew to the mountains, to the sea, into solitude. Not because they were driven away, but because no one listened to them anymore. People started living faster. More celebrations, more shopping, fewer conversations by the hearth, less silence. The city became noisy, too noisy to hear the silence collapsing. Those who still remembered the old days would say, "This is not our way. We've forgotten how it all began." But people called them old folks who were getting in the way of progress. They said, Times are changing, the world is changing. We've become better. And in a way, they were right. More buildings, more goods, more entertainment, but less spirit, less meaning, less moderation. One day, a grand feast was held in the palace of Atlas. Kings from all over Atlantis gathered in a hall adorned with precious gems. An orchestra played, rare wines were served, people laughed, sang, and boasted. And somewhere between the songs and speeches, someone said, "We are the best. No one can compare to us. We are immortal." This phrase did not bring about silence. On the contrary, the hall erupted in applause. But at that very moment, something in the air seemed to tremble, as if the earth itself paused, listened, and turned away. Plato doesn't describe the details. He doesn't say, "This is when the end began." He only shows it through the atmosphere, through behavior, through words. Atlantis was no longer a utopia. It had become a reflection of pride. The island was great, but too heavy for its own wisdom. And the higher the tower of achievements rose, the weaker its foundation became. Golden roofs can't save you when the heart is empty. Marble staircases can't hold if there's nothing beneath them. It wasn't a loud collapse, not an invasion, not a catastrophe. It was a weakening, like a body that no longer nourishes the soul, like a tree whose roots are already dead but whose leaves are still green, and only the sea knew. It sensed the vibration of pride and waited. Somewhere on a distant shore, a wave gently struck the rock. Again and again, as if testing, as if watching closely. And in the cities, people were celebrating. They didn't feel the tremors underground, didn't hear the cracking in the depths, didn't notice that the sky had changed. Atlantis floated in its radiance. But below, beneath the rings of water, beneath the bridges, beneath the temples, something was moving slowly, inevitably. But for now, everything was as it always had been. Feasts, music, laughter, and only a bright, lonely star in the sky, as if it were watching, as if it were warning. But who looks at the stars when the city lights are shining inside? It was an ordinary day. The sky was clear, the sea was calm. Children played in the gardens, ships entered the harbors. Servants were setting tables in the homes of the nobility. Priests were preparing for the morning rituals. Kings were reviewing reports on trade, armies, and construction. Nothing foretold the end. But something was changing underground. First came the sound, not loud, not threatening, more like strange. A deep rumble, as if the earth itself had sighed. People looked around, listened, and went back to their business. Then came the tremor. Not an earthquake, more like a shudder, as if the island remembered that it was not eternal. The palaces trembled, the fountain stopped singing, and some animals started behaving strangely. Birds soared into the sky, even though it was still early. Dogs howled. Fish disappeared from the surface of the canals. And then it all began. The earth shuddered, not just once. Not like a wave, but as if something was tearing it apart from the inside. The towers swayed and houses cracked. Those who were out on the streets fell down. Those who were sleeping woke up in a panic. People screamed, ran, and had no idea what they were running from. After all, there was no enemy, no army. There was only the fury of nature itself. The sea receded, exposing the shore. The ships were left stranded on dry land. People went out to take a look and never came back. A few minutes later, the wave returned 100 times higher. It rose up like a wall, sweeping away everything, docks, markets, temples. People vanished in the water like grains of sand. Ships were smashed to pieces like toys. The mountains split open. Fire and ash rose into the sky. Clouds covered the sun. Hail poured down from the heavens. Lightning struck the gilded roofs. The temple of Poseidon, the pride of Atlantis, cracked down the middle. The statue of the god fell, as if turning away from his creation. Mosaics crumbled, columns collapsed. Those who tried to escape ran toward the rings of land. But the bridges had already collapsed. Water surged in, flooding everything in its path. People prayed, screamed, searched for their loved ones, but everything lost meaning far too quickly. The cities didn't disappear gradually, they were wiped away. Everything that had been built over centuries was destroyed in a matter of hours. Towers slid into the water, palaces collapsed in on themselves. Streets cracked open, the fissures turning into chasms, and no one came to help. No one saved them, because there was no way to be saved. Plato wrote, "In a single day and night of misfortune, Atlantis disappeared, sinking into the depths of the sea. One day, one night, and it was all over. When morning came, it was gone. The sky was gray, the sea empty. Where Atlantis had been, there was nothing, not a piece of marble, not a bit of gold, not a single statue. Only water, dark, deep, silent. And that silence was more terrifying than screams, because it said, everything that seemed eternal disappears quietly, without a trace. The few who lived far away, on neighboring islands, on the shores, later told stories about it, about the fire, about the waves, about a sound that no instrument could reproduce, about the sky that turned black. But Atlantis left no bodies, no wreckage, as if it had not been a city, but a thought. And the thought vanished. Many centuries have passed since then. The sea became calm again. The water hid the secret, and only in the books, voices, did Atlantis remain, and everyone who heard its name felt a slight unease. Could it really have existed? Could it really be possible? But maybe Atlantis did not disappear. Maybe it simply went to the place where ideas live. To the place where silence reigns, where gold is unnecessary, where there is no envy, where everything was right, but only for a short time. And every time people forget simplicity, the ocean reminds them. Every time society loses its balance, the myth resurfaces again. Not as a threat, but as a memory, as a reflection, as a warning whispered from the depths. Atlantis disappeared, but the memory of it remained. And even though the waters closed over its towers, in people's minds there remained the image of greatness lost in an instant. And that's when the search began. Not an archaeological or philosophical search, not with a map, but with questions. Where was it? When? Why did it disappear? The first person to hear the name Atlantis, from Plato's lips was his student Aristotle. He didn't believe the story was real. He said Plato invented it as a model for philosophical discussion. But even if he doubted it, the very idea had already taken root. In ancient Greece and Rome, people had different attitudes toward the legend. Some thought it was a fabrication, while others considered it an unproven fact. But it left no one indifferent. Because even if Atlantis was a myth, it was too detailed, too vivid, too real. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell, cities perished, books were lost, but Plato's text survived. In the Middle Ages, people hardly spoke about Atlantis. The world was preoccupied with other fears, plague, wars, religious strife. The legend of the sunken city remained in the shadows. But during the Renaissance, it returned. And it came back not just as a myth, but as a calling. The 14th and 15th centuries. Europe is awakening. An interest in ancient texts emerges. Philosophers, artists, and sailors begin reading Plato again. And among the lines of Timaeus, they find that very phrase about an island larger than Libya and Asia, located beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The Pillars of Hercules are what we now call Gibraltar. So does that mean Atlantis was in the Atlantic? Sailors look to the west and see emptiness. But they're no longer searching for gold, they're searching for meaning. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sets out on his voyage. He's looking for India, but some of his companions believe he'll find Atlantis. Soon after the discovery of America, rumors begin to spread. What if Atlantis is actually the New World? Maybe these are the remnants of that very sunken civilization. In the 16th century, Francis Bacon, a philosopher and writer, publishes his work, The New Atlantis. He doesn't try to prove its existence. He creates an ideal image of a future society inspired by Plato. There, in the New Atlantis, science, wisdom, and equality reign. It's no longer an island of the past, it's a utopia of the future. And in this way, Atlantis gains a second life. Now, people aren't searching for it in the sea, they're building it in their minds. But the literal search hasn't stopped either. Researchers look for islands that have disappeared from maps, compare tectonic plates, and search for evidence of catastrophes. The Azores, the Canaries, the Bahamas, all become potential locations for Atlantis. Some believe that Plato was talking about Santorini, an island in the Aegean Sea where a volcanic eruption destroyed the Minoan civilization. Others point to the Sahara, saying that there was once a sea here and a civilization lived on its shores. Some believe in Atlantis off the coast of Antarctica, while others think it's still hidden beneath the ocean floor. But all of that came later. In the first centuries after Plato, Atlantis lived in books, not in the ground. And everyone who searched for it started with an idea, not a shovel. Why were people so eager to find it? After all, there were other legends too. But it was Atlantis, like a call from the depths, like a voice whispering, "You can become better, or you'll disappear like I did." Atlantis became more than just a lost land. It became a mirror in which every philosopher, sailor, and ruler looked and saw themselves. Are you searching for the truth? Look at Atlantis. Do you seek power? Remember Atlantis. Are you building an empire? Study its downfall. That is the power of myth. It doesn't require proof. It works without archaeology. It lives in questions. And every century asks them all over again. The 19th century. Science is advancing. Technology is developing. Maps are becoming more accurate. Humanity has already visited the most remote corners of the earth. But the mystery of Atlantis still won't let anyone rest. Now it's not philosophers, but explorers who join the game. They take compasses, telescopes, underwater maps, and set out to search for traces. In 1882, American congressman and writer Ignatius Donnelly publishes a book that will change the way people see Atlantis, the antediluvian world. In it, he claims that Atlantis is not a myth, but a real civilization, the ancestor of all known cultures, that Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Maya, and the Aztecs are merely descendants of surviving Atlanteans, that before the flood there was a single center of knowledge, technology, and spirituality, and that it all began on that very sunken island. The book became a sensation. And although the academic community was skeptical about it, millions of people around the world were inspired by the idea. What if Donnelly is right? Expeditions begin. Some search for Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean, others off the coast of India, some in the Bermuda Triangle, some in the Sahara, and some in Bolivia. A huge number of maps appear, showing mysterious islands that appear and disappear. Any submerged piece of land becomes a suspect. Any underwater structure becomes a reason for speculation. But along with scientific attempts, something else arrives. The 20th century. The world splits into two camps. One, skeptics. They say Atlantis is a metaphor, a utopia, Plato's political pamphlet. The other, romantics. For them, Atlantis is the cradle of all humanity, a super civilization destroyed by its own pride, and, against this backdrop, a special category emerges: esotericists, theosophists, spiritualists, mystics, who start talking about the vibrations of Atlantis. That the Atlanteans possessed power surpassing modern technology, that they used crystals, levitation, telepathy, and that the memory of their abilities is hidden in the subconscious of every person. A special role was played by Helena Blavatsky, the founder of the Theosophical Society. She claimed that Atlantis was one of the ancient races that preceded the modern one, that its destruction was part of the cycle of humanity's rebirth, and that one day it would be revived not in the ocean, but in consciousness. Even more exotic versions have also appeared. Some believe that the Atlanteans were aliens, others think they moved to a parallel dimension, and still others say they are still living deep underground or at the bottom of the ocean. Meanwhile, in the 1960s, a new wave of interest began. Underwater cameras, radars, and sonars appeared. Scientists begin to explore the ocean floor in hopes of finding traces of cities, streets, and columns. Near Bimini, close to the Bahamas, they discover a mysterious stone structure, a perfectly straight line made of huge blocks. It is immediately called the Road to Atlantis. Although geologists explain that it is a natural formation, people believe this is proof. Television, magazines, and movies pick up the topic. Atlantis becomes part of popular culture. Documentaries are made about it, science fiction novels are written, and games are created. Every new discovery, even if it has nothing to do with Atlantis, sparks a wave of publications. The capital of a sunken world has been found. Traces of a vanished civilization. Proof of Atlantis's existence is close. Interest grows in other sunken worlds, Dvina, Kant, Mu. People start searching not for just one Atlantis, but for many. This points to the main thing. Atlantis is more than just a single myth. It is a symbol, a dream, a call to something lost, something that perhaps we are not searching for outside, but within ourselves. Modern archaeologists keep searching. Satellite images, 3D modeling, deep-sea probes, all of these are being used. But so far, nothing definite. Not a single artifact definitively linked to Atlantis, not a single written source besides Plato. And yet, the interest doesn't fade. On the contrary, it keeps growing, because Atlantis is no longer needed as a geographical location. It serves as a reminder that even the greatest civilizations can disappear, and that their memory can outlast stone. We search for Atlantis in the sands, in the ocean, in legends, in DNA structures, in sounds, in dreams. But perhaps Plato was speaking to us across the centuries not as a historian, but as a sage. And maybe the only Atlantis we can truly find is the one that lives in the question. If you had your own Atlantis, would you be able to preserve it? The waters have long since covered Atlantis, but its images remain. They have dissolved into colors, into music, into books, into poetry. and they turned the sunken city into a symbol, into a legend that can never be forgotten. Every era saw Atlantis in its own way. For some, it was a warning, for others, a dream. And some saw it as a lost paradise, a place where everything was right until people ruined it. This duality is what made it eternal. Because Atlantis is not just a city that disappeared into the sea. It's an idea. An idea about how beautiful everything can be, and how quickly it can vanish. Poets turn to Atlantis to speak of lost love, of futures that never came to be, of childhood that has passed, of dreams that have sunk. In every phrase, it's not just a city. In every line, there's silence, loss, and the hope that someday we'll find our way back. In the 19th century, the poet Edgar Poe mentions Atlantis in his verses. He doesn't describe it directly. He creates an atmosphere, as if the city is still out there somewhere, where the ocean becomes too deep, where the sun never reaches the bottom, where the silence is heavier than stone. Artists create paintings with golden spires submerged in water, blue domes overgrown with coral, ruined bridges where fish wander, temples where silence reigns, broken only by the movement of the waves. These paintings are not historical reconstructions. They are emotions, a nostalgia for something we have never seen and yet feel as if it is a part of us. Composers write music inspired by Atlantis. Slow chords, the sounds of water, the echo of sunken bell towers. These melodies seem to float gently, unhurried, carrying the listener deeper and deeper. Not toward answers, but toward feelings. In the 20th century, Atlantis becomes part of cinema. Movies, cartoons, documentaries, all of them interpret the myth in their own way. In one film, it's a high-tech civilization. In another, it's a spiritual realm hidden from people. In a third, it's a utopia that collapsed because of greed. But the meaning remains. Atlantis is the what if. If people were better, if we hadn't lost our balance, if only. Science fiction writers send their heroes searching for the city underwater, in the mountains, in space. Sometimes they find Atlantis, sometimes they get lost themselves, because Atlantis is always a journey inward, not just down the coordinates, but deep into the mind. The philosophy of Atlantis became a subject for reflection on progress, on morality, on where technology leads without wisdom, on how easy it is to lose something great if you forget the simple things. It became a linguistic symbol. When people say, "This is Atlantis," they often mean something beautiful and vanished, knowledge lost to time, a city erased from the map, a dream that can never be reclaimed. Compare. The Library of Alexandria is the Atlantis of knowledge, ancient Rome is the Atlantis of empires, childhood is the Atlantis of the soul. These are not just names, they are synonyms for loss. But not a hopeless loss, a bright one, like the memory of something important that once was, and for which you are grateful, even if you couldn't hold on to it. Atlantis became a convenient framework for storytelling. Through it, you can talk about anything, about politics, through the image of a collapsed system, about a person, through their fear of losing control, about the future, through the hope that we can rebuild our own Atlantis, but this time not on the outside, but within ourselves. In this sense, Atlantis is not a city, it is a mirror, and everyone looks into it in their own way. Some see beauty, some see a warning, and some see a chance to start over. But no one just walks by. It's impossible not to pause when you hear that word. There's something ancient in it, something familiar, and something deeply personal. Atlantis is not just a legend. Over time, it became something more, a symbol, an archetype, a collective image that everyone recognizes, even if they've never read Plato. Carl Jung, one of the greatest psychologists of the 20th century, spoke about the collective unconscious, a set of images and symbols that live within each of us. Atlantis fits perfectly into this category. It's the image of a paradise we've lost, a vision of greatness we couldn't hold on to, a symbol of the depths where something important has disappeared, and we're still searching for it. In philosophy, Atlantis is often seen as a metaphor for cycles, rise, flourishing, and fall. This isn't just a historical process, it's a universal law. Any system, once it reaches its peak, faces the challenge of maintaining balance, and almost always falls. Atlantis became a reminder. Progress without morality leads to destruction, power without wisdom leads to disaster, and wealth without restraint leads to collapse. Some thinkers say Atlantis is. It's not a warning, it's a mirror. Every generation sees in it what it fears losing. For some, it's technology. For others, it's spirituality. For still others, it's nature, culture, tradition, or a connection to the past. In religious thought, Atlantis is sometimes compared to Eden. It's the same place from which humanity was expelled, not physically, but morally. Not because one person sinned, but because an entire society lost its balance. Just as there was a prohibition in Eden, there was a limit in Atlantis. Just as there was a fruit in Eden, there was wealth in Atlantis. And in both cases, humanity chose greed over restraint. And in both cases, what followed was a departure. In politics, Atlantis is sometimes used as an example of the downfall of great powers, empires that thought they were eternal. They built temples, conquered the world, but couldn't keep themselves in check. Rome, Byzantium, the Inca Empire, the British Empire, and modern superpowers. In each one, you can find elements of Atlantis, a period of flourishing, complacency, isolation from criticism, and then a fall. Atlantis has become both a utopia and a dystopia at the same time. It is the image of a perfect society that fell. So it both inspires and warns us at the same time. Philosophers call such images paradoxical archetypes. They are ambiguous, and that's exactly why they're universal. In culture, the very word Atlantis has become a household name. People say, this tradition is like Atlantis, great but forgotten. He lives as if he's building his own Atlantis, an ideal but fragile world. This project is a potential Atlantis, beautiful but doomed. In psychology, Atlantis often becomes a metaphor for inner processes, what a person has lost within themselves, childhood, wholeness, peace. Some therapists even use this word as a symbol. Let's find your Atlantis, the place inside where you were in balance. This helps a person look deeper, not at the past as a chronology, but at the past as a feeling. Sometimes Atlantis is compared to memory, something that can't be seen, but can be felt. Something was there. We know it, but we can't prove it. Like a shadow at the edge of consciousness, like a melody you've forgotten but can hear again if you really listen. In this way, Atlantis is not just a cultural artifact, it's a focal point around which thoughts, fears, dreams, society, history, and identity revolve. It brings together philosophy as the idea of cycles, psychology as the image of lost balance, religion as a version of exile from paradise, politics as a metaphor for the decline of empires, and language as a symbol of something lost but still alive. That's exactly why Atlantis continues to exist. As long as people think, feel, and remember, it will be there. not in the ocean, but within us. We live in the age of technology. Satellites fly above the Earth, scanners probe the depths of the ocean, and it seems like there's no room left for myths. But Atlantis doesn't give up, keeps hiding or waiting. Modern scientists have different attitudes toward the legend of the sunken city. Some are skeptical while others are curious. But almost every archaeologist has wondered at least once, what if Plato didn't make it all up? Plato wrote that Atlantis was located beyond the Pillars of Hercules. That's present-day Gibraltar. So somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. This became the starting point for dozens of hypotheses. Some point to the Canary Islands, others to the Azores, some to Bimini near the Bahamas, and others to underwater plateaus that can be seen in satellite images. Each hypothesis is accompanied by maps, diagrams, and comparisons with Plato's descriptions. For example, he mentioned that the island had a ring structure with alternating bands of water and land. Some researchers find similar shapes on the ocean floor near the Canaries. But the scientific approach requires evidence. One of the most famous examples is the so-called Bimini Road. In 1968, divers discovered a straight line of stones on the seafloor off the coast of the Bahamas. The slabs were massive, neatly arranged, and lay close to each other. It seemed like an ancient road. Atlantis enthusiasts declared, "It has been found." But geologists explained, this is a natural formation created by limestone erosion. And yet, doubt remained. Today, science uses the most precise methods: sonar, underwater three-dimensional mapping, magnetic and gravimetric surveys, radiocarbon analysis of finds, and high-resolution satellite images. With their help, dozens of underwater structures have been discovered. Some of them still remain unexplained. They are not proof of Atlantis, but they are reasons for new expeditions. A separate field is archaeology. Scientists study ancient maps, coastlines, and sediment deposits. They ask whether there could have been an island in the past that sank beneath the water. The answer is yes. The world's oceans have risen and fallen. Catastrophic eruptions and earthquakes could change the landscape in just a matter of hours. History knows many such examples. Islands that disappeared forever. One of them is Santorini, also known as ancient Thera. Around 1600 BC, the volcano erupted so powerfully that it destroyed part of the island. Some believe that this very event inspired Plato to create the story of Atlantis. There really was an advanced Minoan civilization on Santorini. They had writing, architecture, trade, and they disappeared after the eruption. There are just too many coincidences to ignore. In Spain, in the area of Donana National Park, anomalies have also been found. Some satellite images have shown shapes resembling concentric circles. Scientific teams began their research. Traces of submerged structures, pottery, and debris were discovered. They are thousands of years old. But there are no inscriptions or confirmed connection to Plato. In Morocco and Mauritania, stone structures have been found that some call the Atlantic Circle. Particular attention was drawn to the so-called Eye of the Sahara. Rikhat is a massive geological formation that looks like rings. Some are convinced that this is Atlantis, not in the ocean, but on land that was once underwater. Rikhat truly has an amazing shape, and it matches many of Plato's descriptions. But scientists believe it is the result of geological processes, not human architecture. Nevertheless, science does not rule out that Plato may have been inspired by real events, a catastrophe, a flood, the disappearance of a city. But his story contains both philosophy and allegory. That means we need to search not only underwater, but also for the meaning. Today, the scientific community is divided into three camps. Skeptics believe Atlantis is a fabrication. Rationalists allow for the possibility that a real event lies behind the myth. Romantics believe that the discovery is still ahead of us. Each of these positions is important because together they create a dialogue between knowledge and dreams. Atlantis remains a challenge. For science, it's a chance to unite archaeology, geology, and oceanology. For philosophy, an opportunity to rethink the nature of civilizations. And for individuals, a question, what is it that we want to find? An island or ourselves? We have entered an era where the mysteries of antiquity are sought not only through expeditions, but also on the screen. The modern seeker of Atlantis doesn't always put on scuba gear. More often, they open a laptop, connect to a satellite, launch Google Earth, and peer into the digital waves. Thousands of people around the world study the ocean floor online. They look for circles, straight lines, and formations that seem unnatural. Sometimes they find something, and immediately headlines appear, "Here it is, Atlantis." The map has been revealed, traces of civilization underwater. The most famous example is the so-called Atlantis grid. In 2009, Google Ocean users discovered a rectangular grid on the ocean floor in the Atlantic, not far from the Azores. The lines were straight like streets, as if someone had built a city and hidden it underwater. The media started talking. It's been found. But Google soon came out with an explanation. It was a trace left by sonar routes passing along the ocean floor. The data overlay was not a real object. Disappointing? Yes, but the belief didn't disappear. With the rise of the internet, a new phenomenon emerged: digital mythology. Hundreds of videos appear on YouTube, comparisons of Plato's descriptions with the landscapes of the Sahara, 3D models of the Eye of the Sahara, pseudo-documentary investigations, secret maps, videos with voices saying, "What is hidden will soon be found." It sounds mysterious, but for many, it's convincing. And just like that, Atlantis goes viral. Hashtags, theories, comments. Some people find inspiration in this, others just see it as entertainment. And some start to believe more strongly than ever. Now add artificial intelligence to the mix. Now you can enter into a neural network, create a visual image of the city based on Plato's description. And you'll get a three-dimensional image. Rings of water, temples, towers, canals, golden bridges. Thousands of images of Atlantis are created in just seconds. None of them are real, but each one brings the myth closer. Neural networks aren't searching for the truth. They generate representations, and in doing so, they fuel the imagination. And now kids are drawing Atlantis in their notebooks. Artists are creating music inspired by the sounds of the ancient city. Gamers are building Atlantis in Minecraft, and writers are publishing fantasy stories where the sunken civilization returns. The irony is that the more technology advances, the deeper the myth becomes. We're not destroying the legend, we're spreading it everywhere the internet can reach. Now Atlantis lives on TikTok, in Reels, in Instagram stories, on Discord servers, and in neural network dreams. What does that mean? Has it become part of our digital subconscious? Like a Jungian archetype only updated with Wi-Fi. Along with this, a new problem has emerged. Where is the line between myth and manipulation? Websites appear promising proof. Maps of ancient Atlantis are being sold. People go on expeditions for money, and instead of the spirit of exploration, a marketplace emerges. This is also part of the myth, because Atlantis has always been not just about dreams, but about temptation as well. Against this backdrop, serious scholars try to maintain a balance. They conduct research, they write articles, they study satellite data, but with verification. They publish reports with titles like Geological Structure of the Underwater Yukon Plateau, not Atlantis Found. But the public doesn't always want a scientific tone. She wants a miracle, or at least a half-whispered phrase, "What if?" And this is the main discovery of the digital age. Now anyone can search for Atlantis, but everyone is searching for their own version. Some will look underwater, some in Google, and some will search for something within themselves. So, the search has become endless, but not useless, because everyone who searches asks themselves, where is my point of balance? Where did I lose something important? What would I do if I found my own Atlantis? The world has become digital, but Atlantis is still alive. And maybe one day we will see not a myth, but a reflection. Every myth has a voice. Some are fierce, others gentle. But Atlantis has the voice of silence. Yet it was in this very silence that great art was born. Atlantis became an inspiration for artists. Hundreds of paintings created over the past 200 years depict it as a majestic, yet lost world. Towers sinking into the depths, golden domes reflected in the water, statues standing on the seabed among the seaweed, fish swimming between the columns. Sometimes these paintings are precise, sometimes they feel like dreams. But in each of them there is emotion, nostalgia, a longing to touch lost perfection. Music is another language of myth. Composers have turned to Atlantis again and again. Some created operas where the city lived, loved, and was destroyed. Others, symphonies where every note spoke of depth, of tragedy, of beauty. Claude Debussy dreamed of creating an opera called The King of Atlantis. Hans Zimmer used images of sunken worlds in his soundtracks. Modern neoclassical composers write albums where you can hear water, echoes, the whisper of the ocean floor. Every chord is not just a sound, it's an immersion. The listener doesn't just hear, they dive underwater and, together with the music, remember. What exactly is not clear, but it's something personal, something deep. In cinema, Atlantis has become an entire genre. Since 1913, dozens of films have been made where she is the center of action, the mystery, or the backdrop. Sometimes it's a high-tech metropolis, sometimes an ancient spiritual civilization, and sometimes just a legend that the characters are trying to decipher. But in any case, it carries the atmosphere of something forgotten, sunken, unfinished. In 2001, Disney released the animated film Atlantis, The Lost Empire. For many, this was their first introduction to the legend. In this story, Atlantis is not just a city. It's a world where what has been lost is not technology, but meaning. The film asks, what would you do if you discovered an ancient civilization? Would you take its power, or would you try to preserve it? It's a question that resonates with everyone. Atlantis has appeared in literature across all genres, from fantasy, where it exists in other worlds, to science fiction, where it was forgotten after a catastrophe, and even in detective stories, where the hero isn't searching for a criminal, but for traces of a sunken truth. Jules Verne, Arthur Conan Doyle, H.G. Wells, Lovecraft, Isaac Asimov, each of them, at some point, touched on the theme of the sunken world because it's universal. Atlantis has also made its way into architecture. Some buildings, hotels, and even underwater restaurants are built in the style of that sunken city. Columns that look like ruins. Mosaics that remind you of the ocean floor. Huge aquariums as a symbol of underwater life. The Atlantis aesthetic isn't about glamour. It's about silence, depth, and the feeling that you're inside a legend. Even in fashion, this image finds its reflection. Fabrics in the color of sea water, jewelry that looks as if it's covered in coral, and designs that blend antiquity with mystery. It's not just a style, it's an attempt to wear a myth to make it a part of yourself. Atlantis is a frequent guest in video games. In Assassin's Creed, Tomb Raider, Subnautica, BioShock, you can hear echoes of it everywhere. Players don't just read about the myth. They step into it, walk its streets, explore its temples, and immerse themselves in its atmosphere. And every time, the question remains, is this an adventure or a memory? That's the true mystery of art. It doesn't require proof. It simply feels. And if an artist paints Atlantis, he doesn't ask, did it really exist? He just knows it exists somewhere, maybe not on a map, but definitely in images. And that's why the myth never disappears. It inspires, it nourishes, it brings memories to life, even if those memories aren't about real places, but about feelings. Atlantis has become a part of everything. A little utopian, a little sad, but that's exactly what makes it real. Sometimes it feels like everything has already been said. Thousands of years have passed since Plato first uttered the name Atlantis. Hundreds of books, movies, songs, and theories. And yet, every year someone writes about it all over again. Why? Because Atlantis isn't a story, it's a state of being. How many generations have passed since Plato's time? Each one lived in its own context, but in each, something was reflected in the image of Atlantis. For people of the 18th century, it was a symbol of lost harmony. The Age of Enlightenment strove for reason and order, and saw a warning in the myth. Without spirituality, reason is blind. For the 19th century, Atlantis became a symbol of expansion. Colonial powers dreamed of discovering new lands, but deep down they sensed they themselves were becoming the new Atlantis. Great but doomed. In the 20th century, Atlantis took on a new face. After the World Wars, when civilization saw what it was capable of, people once again began to wonder, are we really not repeating their path? Bombs, camps, ruined cities, all of it seemed like echoes of those very lines from Plato. They lost the divine within themselves, and the earth rejected them. The Cold War only intensified this feeling. Two superpowers standing on the brink of the world's destruction, and once again the question hung in the air, what if we become the next Atlantis? For the youth at the end of the 20th century, Atlantis became an aesthetic, an image of something hidden, profound, and lost. Something like a mythical world where you can hide from the noise of the present, retreat into the depths where everything is quieter, slower, more meaningful. In the 21st century, the myth became more flexible, turned into a meme, a motif, a template for stories. But at the same time, it also became an anchor. In a world where everything moves fast, Atlantis says, stop, look at what you're building, and ask yourself if you can hold on to it. Today, the younger generation who grew up with the internet has for the first time gained the ability not only to consume myth, but to recreate it. Videos, comics, storytelling, art, games, neural networks, all of these have become tools for new myth-making. And Atlantis hasn't disappeared. It has just changed its form. It no longer demands grand declarations. It simply appears wherever there is talk of loss, reevaluation, greed, wisdom, and the line between what is possible and what is necessary. Psychologists say, Atlantis is an archetype of the end, a warning. It lives in the fear of losing control, in anxiety about our own progress, in the feeling that you no longer control what you have created. That's exactly why it fits so naturally into the culture of an anxious age. But there's another side to it. Atlantis is not just a warning. It's also a dream of a place where everything was harmonious, where there was no hustle, noise, or aggression, where people lived in balance with nature, with themselves, with the sky and the sea. And if one half of society looks at the myth with caution, the other half sees it with hope. That's why it's depicted on book covers. That's why people write quiet, slow songs with notes that evoke water. That's why movie heroes still dive to the bottom of the ocean in search of a city that may never have existed. But that doesn't really matter, because Atlantis isn't about finding it, but about asking yourself, what have I lost within myself? What did I once know and forget? What used to be harmonious and has become noisy? What do I need to reclaim so I don't drown in my own time? That's why the myth doesn't sink. As long as people search, as long as people yearn, as long as people dream, Atlantis lives on. It lives in memory, in water, in the pauses between words, in the silence behind the screen. And anyone who has ever heard its name will never forget it. What makes a myth is not just an ancient story, not just a tale passed down from mouth to mouth. A myth is an idea encoded in the memory of humanity. And Atlantis is one of the most vibrant ideas ever told. Philosophy is the science of meaning. It doesn't seek evidence like archaeology, and it doesn't require faith like religion. It asks questions. And the main question philosophers have asked about Atlantis is, why do we want so badly for it to be real? After all, it seems to be a tragedy. A story about destruction. About how a great civilization disappears because of pride. But we cling to it, we draw it, write about it, search for it, retell it. So it's not about the place, but about the meaning. Plato most likely didn't want us to take Atlantis literally. He was a philosopher, not a chronicler. And when he spoke about a city with rings of water, about kings, about a downfall, he was talking about people, about how inside each of us there is an island, surrounded by the outside world, with its own temple, its own laws, its own temptations. As long as a person is in balance, this island holds together. But as soon as you lose moderation, lose your essence, the island starts to sink. Not necessarily in water. Sometimes in chaos, sometimes in fear, sometimes within oneself. Philosophers see Atlantis not as a city, but as a state of being. A state of the world where balance was found. And it couldn't be maintained, just like the balance between reason and emotion, between nature and technology, between the spiritual and the material. Atlantis serves as a reminder that even perfection is fragile, that you can't consider yourself above the laws of nature, that everything can be lost if you forget where you started. It's not a punishment, it's a principle. The philosophy of moderation. Socrates, Plato's teacher, taught moderation. He said, "Know thyself." And in Plato's work, Atlantis seems like a response to that advice. If you don't know yourself, you'll disappear. Not in flames, not in a storm, but in silence. Like an island that sank beneath the water because it lost its connection to the depths. That's why Atlantis is such a powerful image. It doesn't say, beware. It says, stop, look inside yourself. Modern philosophers continue to discuss Atlantis not as a fact, but as a concept. Some say it's an archetype of loss. Others see it as an image of a civilization repeating its mistakes. Some view it as the idea of an impossible utopia, beautiful but unattainable. That's exactly why it stirs people more than any other legend. Egypt, Rome, Babylon, these were real civilizations. We can measure them, excavate them, study them. But Atlantis is outside of all that. It has no time, no coordinates, no physical form. And that's why it's closer. Philosophy often speaks through images. And Atlantis is the perfect image. You can be a philosopher and still search for it. Because searching for Atlantis means searching for yourself. We reach for what's lost not because we love sadness, but because in loss we feel that there was something valuable. And as long as it is remembered, it hasn't disappeared. In this way, the philosophy of Atlantis becomes the philosophy of humanity. We don't know exactly where it was, but we know why it matters. It's a reminder that all great things are built not on stone, but on understanding, humility, and memory. And if we forget this, we repeat the journey not underwater, but into emptiness. Sometimes you just can't explain why something resonates with you. You read the word Atlantis, and you feel something. Nostalgia, calm, sadness. But behind these feelings, it's not just a reaction, it's an inner response. Psychologists say that everyone needs a personal myth, a symbol through which they can make sense of their own story, their loss, their longing, their shadow. Atlantis is perfect for this because almost all of us have something that once was, something that has sunk, something we can't get back. Childhood, a sense of safety, a first love, an idea we once believed in, a state of peace that's long gone. Sometimes a person lives as if they have a sunken city inside them, with its streets, its temples, its silence. And he knows that there was something there once, something deep and very important. We rarely talk about it out loud, but in dreams, in music, in strange thoughts before sleep, it comes back. The image of something sunken, not destroyed, not burned, but gone. Quietly, the myth of Atlantis doesn't weigh on you. It doesn't shout, it whispers. It says, you remember, it's still there. You can go back, but not like before, deeper. Because it's not just about returning to something. It's about returning to yourself, to who you were when you weren't afraid yet, when you still believed, when you could still feel the silence instead of the noise. That's why, in a world full of speed, Atlantis is relevant again. People get tired and want to leave. Not forever, not to run away, but to go deeper, to recover, to rethink, to find solid ground. Atlantis isn't a symbol of disaster. It's a symbol of restoration. A place you can drift to in your mind to become yourself again. You close your eyes and imagine a city submerged underwater. Light filters through the depths. Silence, slow movement, peace. And you walk along its streets. You hear the ringing of silence. You see temples where there is no pain. You see your former self and you realize you haven't lost it. You simply sent it deep down so you could come back later stronger. Atlantis within us is everything we didn't have time to experience. Everything we put off. Everything we cherished but couldn't hold on to. And if you allow yourself to go back there, even just in your mind, something inside begins to heal. You don't have to look for proof. You don't have to know exactly where it was. It's enough just to feel. Something inside you responds. That means you're alive and you remember. Myths live for thousands of years because they touch not on facts, but on depth. They're not about what once was, but about what always is. Atlantis isn't a matter of archaeology. It's a matter of silence and the willingness to enter it. That's why, when you hear its name, something inside you slows down, it becomes quieter, you become attentive, and maybe, at that very moment, your inner Atlantis begins to rise. Not to the surface, but into your consciousness, so you can once again see what truly matters to you, what you've lost, and what you want to preserve. We've reached the end of the story, journeyed through myth and philosophy, through archaeology and music, through faith and memories. But Atlantis is not a period. It's a pause. That's where all the meaning lies. When Plato wrote about the fall of the great city, he wasn't trying to frighten anyone. He wasn't building an apocalypse. He was showing that even perfection has its limits if it isn't accompanied by a soul. For us, Atlantis became not a place, but a direction, a quiet point of reference. Something you can't see on a map, but you feel it when you lose your way. You can't get there by ship, but you can sense you're heading the wrong way, exactly when it starts to remind you of itself from deep within. It's like a voice. Don't rush, listen. Remember why you started. Don't lose your balance. Sometimes it's a voice at the moment of choice, when you're standing before something important and don't know which way to go. And suddenly, it's like an echo inside. Too much doesn't mean it's good. Too fast doesn't mean it's right. Too loud doesn't mean it's true. That's what Atlantis is. It doesn't dictate, it whispers, because the truth never shouts. In the noise of life, we often lose ourselves, but myths remain and remind us who we are, what mattered, and what can become ours again, if we choose. That's why Atlantis lives longer than cities, longer than empires, longer than eras, because it isn't built from stone, it's built from meaning. And that meaning is simple. True greatness lies in simplicity. True civilization is in balance. True wealth is in silence. When you build something new, remember Atlantis. Not as a warning, but as a hint, gentle, silent, yet precise. Sometimes we think that loss is the end, but Atlantis says otherwise. Loss is a chance to remember what was truly valuable. And then you don't start building from scratch, but you build deeper. You could say that Atlantis is a compass. It doesn't point to a place, it points to a direction toward inner order, respect for yourself and the world. A calm that doesn't depend on external things. A life where there is enough. Atlantis doesn't want you to become perfect. She wants you to be whole, to live as if your inner island still stands and it is up to you to keep it going. That's how its story ends, not with tragedy, but with the understanding that everything can be lost, but everything can also be understood. Atlantis doesn't need to be found. It needs to be heard, in the place where you are alone, where the noise fades away, where you just sit and feel. Here it is, inside, whole and still alive. Imagine yourself standing on the shore, with the endless sea before you. The waves roll in and recede, quietly, unhurried. You look into the distance and know that out there, it's not a city, not an island, but a thought. Slowly, a feeling surfaces. You've already been there. And maybe not just once. Atlantis never spoke loudly. Its voice is like an echo in the depths, like breathing underwater, like a memory that hasn't been forgotten, but has become a part of you. You don't have to search for it again. You're already with it. It's just that when you remember who you are, each of us needs our own Atlantis. To pause, to exhale, to stay on course, to feel that it's still possible not to get something back, but to understand. Let it stay where it belongs, inside, in images, in feelings, in decisions, in dreams. You can build your life with it not as a goal, but as a compass, quiet, eternal, wise. Maybe that's exactly why Plato never finished his story. He left space for you so that you could finish the myth yourself, with your own choice, your own step, your own attention to the silence. And now, as the story comes to an end, don't rush to return. Just stay here for a while, in this calm, where there's no noise, where words dissolve, and all that's left is you, and somewhere out there, far, far away, deep within your consciousness, Atlantis still echoes. Not as a lost city, but as a balance found. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you felt calm and interested, Please support the channel by subscribing and liking. See you in new stories. For now, let the waves carry you into a soft, deep, peaceful sleep. Good night.